Hello, welcome everyone. I'll just go ahead and start. Welcome from wherever you're joining us. This is our webinar on defining sustainability criteria for marine fuels, which follows the launch of the report with the same name, which was published 2 weeks ago. While we wait for more people to join, please, you can use the QR code on the screen to download the report. The webinar is hosted by the Sustainable Shipping Initiative with support from the Getting to Zero Coalition. And our panelists today are Ingrid Marie Vincent Anderson, Head of Decarbonization Targets and Lifecycle Analysis at AP Motor Maersk, Catherine Palmer, Global Sustainability Manager at Lloyd's Register, and Elena Schmidt, Executive Director of the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. And the session today will be moderated by Randall Krantz, Senior Project Advisor at the Global Maritime Forum. Just to remind you all, this webinar is being recorded. And if you have any questions during the sessions, please post them in the chat. So the chat, not the Q&A function, because the chat will help us all in the background also answer the questions as they come through. My name is Andrea Miu. I'm the Decarbonization Lead at the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. And I'm just gonna walk you through a bit of what the SSI is, and also just give you a bit of background into our report before I hand it over to the panel discussion. So the SSI is a multi-stakeholder collective that brings together like-minded and ambitious leaders spanning the entire shipping value chain to contribute to and thrive in a more sustainable maritime industry. It is a member-led organization, and you can see here on the right-hand side all our members. Currently, there are 15 of them, and as you'll see, they're leading actors in the shipping industries, and they're ship owners and charterers, shipyards, service providers, banks, classification societies, and NGOs. The work that the SSI is doing is guided by the Roadmap to a Sustainable Shipping Industry, which lays out the pathways and defines tangible milestones to be collectively achieved over the coming decades. The roadmap has 6 vision areas: oceans, communities, people, transparency, finance, and energy, and acts as SSI guiding light to identifying key issues where SSI can make the greatest impact. We really see this more as the roadmap to the whole industry, not just the SSI. The working groups that the SSI currently have are on human side of shipping, ship recycling, shipping's transitions to a circular economy, and decarbonization. And all this working group, we try to incorporate all the vision areas in the roadmap. But we are here today to discuss SSI's decarbonization work, and mainly the latest report defining sustainability criteria for marine fuels. But just to give you a brief introduction of how we got here, back in 2018, the SSI commissioned Lloyd's Register and UMAS to create a report on zero emissions vessels. This report highlighted the need for zero emissions vessels to enter the world fleet by 2030, but it also highlighted that biofuels might be an option to decarbonize shipping. Then in 2019, the SSI launched an inquiry into the sustainability and availability of biofuels for shipping. And there were several stakeholder consultations that were part of that inquiry, one of them being actually taking place at Climate Week New York just over 2 years ago. The report then launched at COP25 in Madrid. And following the launch, the IMO invited the SSI to submit the paper to the MEPC, which was great recognition of our work. There were still unanswered questions following the 2019 inquiry. So in late last year, we partnered up with Green Fuel Hub to answer some of those unanswered questions on the availability of sustainable biofuels. And that report was launched in June this year. However, in our journey through all these reports, we really learned that sustainability is not really an issue that's bespoke to biofuels, and sustainability is really, it should really be applied to all zero and low carbon marine fuels that are being under consideration for shipping's decarbonization. So the report, which we launched just 2 weeks ago, as I said, it's called Defining Sustainability Criteria for Marine Fuels. And it was developed by the SSI Decarbonization Working Group together with our academic partner, Copenhagen Business School. The criteria in this report follows a white paper, which was launched earlier this year, which really served as a basis for further consultations and further refining of the criteria. The final report was launched on 8th of September, and an early, slightly uglier version of this report, as in it wasn't designed, was submitted to the Intersessional Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Emissions at the IMO. So just to go in a bit, why did we embark on the journey on defining sustainability criteria for marine fuels? And it's really because as the shipping industry decarbonizes, the stakeholders are trying to understand that decarbonization is not just about lowering or eliminating greenhouse gases. It's also about the other sustainability considerations that need to be observed throughout the full life cycle of the zero and low carbon marine fuel. And once the sustainability issues and the principles and the criteria are defined, then the industry standards can be set and certification programs can be put in place to assure the sustainability of zero and low carbon marine fuels. And I'm sorry, I don't know, seems to be a slight glitch. No, never mind, sorry about that. There was a glitch on my screen. Let's talk about sustainability a bit. As I just said, sustainability is not just about the greenhouse gas emissions and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. It's also, sustainability as a concept is an integration of 3 dimensions. There's the environmental dimension, there's the economic dimension, and there's the social dimension. And when we define the sustainability criteria, we really try to capture all these 3 dimensions in the work that we've done. And the academic partner that we had on this piece of work, CBS Maritime, really helped us define some of those more obscure, let's say, if you want, sustainability criteria that go beyond just greenhouse gas emissions and also focus on the socioeconomics of the fuel life cycle. And the criteria are applied throughout the whole fuel life cycle, and I've said the word life cycle at least 3 times already. So what do we actually mean when we say life cycle? Well, this illustration we've made just to show what we mean by well to tank, what we mean by tank to wake, and what we mean by well to wake. And it's really just for you to see that tank to wake, which tends to be the main area where shipping focuses at the moment, is just really at the end of the fuel value chain. And we need to look at all these other stages before we reach the ship to be able to say that the fuel is truly sustainable. We must ensure that the zero and low carbon fuels for consideration for shipping's decarbonization are selected and invested in the future, to not have adverse impacts across this value chain. So the sustainability criteria we defined can be applied through this whole life cycle. And it's really important to not move the issues from on board the ships, like greenhouse gas emissions, to move them somewhere upwards in the stream, in the value chain. And I put this slide up here just to show you the structure of the sustainability criteria and to see the way they're organized in our report. So SSI and CBS Maritime worked on defining the sustainability issue, principles, and criteria. And however, we, SSI, nor CBS Maritime, we're not a certification body. So we really believe that it's now up to the certification bodies, and we need to look up to them and their guidance on how the criteria can be used to provide assurance when selecting sustainable zero and low carbon fuels. And if you have the report, you'll see that there's the table with the sustainability criteria, which spans like 3 different pages. And I didn't include it all in this presentation because I didn't want to bore you by going through 15 different principles. So I've only selected one as an example. So the example is sustainable resource use. And that's the sustainability issue. And the principle is that the impacts across the life cycle of the zero and low carbon marine fuels should avoid resource depletion and ensure the resource potential to meet the needs of present and future generation. And the criteria that applies to the principle is that the operations in the well-to-wake life cycle stages of the zero and low carbon marine fuel shall ensure the sustainable use of and closed loop approach to resources. So that was a very short and brief introduction into what we are here to discuss today, with mainly sustainability criteria for marine fuels and why it's important and what role does certification play to assure sustainability. I really look forward to the panel discussions and the questions. As I said, please put the questions in the chat function and not in the Q&A function. And before I hand it over to Randall to end the panel, I want to put up this poll. We really want to know who's here with us today, who's joined us, just so we know where the questions are coming from, where your opinions are coming from. Okay, we see you have some ports, some governments, IGOs, NGOs, some fuel producers, academia. Great. Okay, so quite a varied stakeholders groups here. All right, well, thank you very much for everyone. I will come back at the end of the webinar just to close. And from now, please, Randall, take it away.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that introduction. As you pointed out, your work has been driven by many still unanswered questions, and we'll do our best today to answer some of those questions, but I'm sure that we will leave this webinar with more unanswered questions. So the issue of sustainability and how we use criteria, how we measure sustainability, how we address sustainability is obviously one that has been going on for some time. It is reaching certainly a culmination within the shipping industry. And that's very, very exciting. In the run up to COP26, there's a lot of different headlines around shipping and decarbonization. And I think it's important to keep those in the context of broader sustainability. So again, if I can introduce myself, my name is Randall Krantz. I'm with the Global Maritime Forum, and I spend my time working on decarbonization, specifically most of it on the Getting to Zero Coalition, of which the SSI is a knowledge partner. So we've been working very closely over the past few years on decarbonization. And we've also worked very closely in terms of sustainability criteria. And so one of our pieces of work is that we're in the process of developing an open source model. And we've been working with SSI and others on how we look at and evaluate different criteria that will be used both in that model, but also for decision making. So there's some clear overlap with our works. And the other thing that I'll just mention as we dive in the road to COP26 is that the role of all of this is important from the industry perspective, but also from the policy perspective. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit in the conversations today. So being aware of the roles of all the different stakeholders. So what I'd like to do now is invite my panelists to turn on their cameras. First, we'll have Ingrid Marie Anderson from AP Moller Maersk. Then we'll have Catherine Palmer from Lloyd's Register, and Elena Schmidt from the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels. What we'll do is we will have each of our panelists in that order offer some opening remarks. And from there, we'll be collecting your questions through the chat function, but also we have a few questions of our own, and we'll have a broader open discussion, and then we'll be wrapping up a few minutes before the hour. So with that, Ingrid Marie, over to you for a perspective from Maersk on sustainability criteria.
Yeah, thank you, Randall, for that introduction. So my name is Ingrid Marie Andersen, and I head up decarbonization targets and lifecycle assessment in AP Møller Maersk. And in our company, sustainability and decarbonization is quite high on the agenda, as you probably know already. And we have focused in Maersk for many years on energy efficiency, and we have come very far in terms of reducing our CO2 footprint per container we transport. Actually, we've reduced it more than 40% since 2008. But that's not going to get us to zero. And I mean, we still burn roughly 10 million tons of fossil fuels a year. So we need some step changes in order to decarbonize our fleet and the industry. And we need to do that as quickly as possible. So our focus currently is very much on fuels, on future fuels. And we have different focuses on different time horizons. So currently we utilize biodiesels, biofuels in our current eco-delivery.
We'll see if Ingrid Marie is able to come back.
Can scale from a sustainability and availability perspective.
Ingrid, you cut out just for about 30 seconds there and kind of froze. So if you want to just recap your last thought, that might be useful for the audience.
Yeah, what was the last, where did it stop?
It was just kind of at the sustainability and availability of the fuels, and then it kind of froze.
Oh yeah, so the biofuels, they're not hugely available, and they're not scalable either. So we're looking very much into methanol now, both biomethanol and e-methanol. And you probably heard that we ordered a feeder vessel in the spring and 16,000 TEU container vessels recently to run on methanol. So a lot of our work now revolves around sourcing large scale and sustainable amounts of methanol for those vessels. And long-term, other kinds of fuels might play a role, but all these new solutions have in common that sustainability aspects of them is key. So part of what I do and what my team does in Maersk is to look at the life cycle assessment of these new fuels. So we look at all new fuels on a well-to-wake basis, and we consider all the greenhouse gases and the sustainability criteria associated with that. So in this context, the sustainability criteria in this report and this discussion today is something we find extremely relevant.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ingrid, for those remarks and that opening. I think that frames a little bit for our conversation, certainly what a ship owner perspective is and the difficult decisions that you need to make regarding the future fuels that you'll be using. So next, I'll turn to Catherine Palmer from Lloyd's Register. Catherine?
Yeah, thank you very much, Randall, and hello to our audience. And I think this is very timely. The sustainability of potential zero carbon fuels is really increasing in the debate and the agenda as we start to really crystallize shipping's transition pathways. As has already been mentioned, you know, it's been a few years now since we've all built the coalition around zero emission vessels need to be commercially viable, technically feasible, and safe by 2030 if we're going to have any chance of achieving zero by 2050 for the shipping sector. And I think as we focus a lot on the technical readiness, we focus on the commercial readiness. Alongside that, sustainability criteria and the sustainability readiness of the potential fuels needs to be equally considered. And I think the challenge is around not focusing just on greenhouse gases, and particularly just on greenhouse gases for what the shipping industry accounts for from an operational emission perspective, but also, as we've mentioned, to look at the life cycle perspective to ensure that there is no unintended consequences and the shipping industry isn't just moving the problem elsewhere within society, but also to look at sustainability as more than just greenhouse gases. And so that's why this criteria identifies 15 principles and 15 issues that cover not just environment, but also cover the social side and the economic sustainability as well. So I think it's important to look at it from that perspective. And I think what we're seeing, or what I see in the industry, you know, there are already existing schemes and existing standards. And so this isn't about the maritime industry creating something new and bespoke to itself. It's about how we can use existing standards, get that harmonization across other end user sectors, to ensure that we're providing assurance to our stakeholders that the fuels that the shipping industry is using are sustainable and not providing any unintended, not causing any unintended consequences elsewhere along the life cycle. So I'm looking forward to the discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. The issue of not causing unintended consequences is certainly a clear one that we need to pay attention to. And you've certainly underscored that we need to look at more than just greenhouse gases and more than just the shipping portion of those greenhouse gases when we're looking at them. So maybe to talk about unintended consequences, among other things, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels, this is something that you look at. So Elena Schmidt, over to you to share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Randall, and also thank you to the SSI for organizing this fantastic panel. RSB is, in the meantime, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, because we also moved into materials and chemical space. So we are a membership-based organization bringing together industry leaders, academia, NGO experts, producers of different scales, who all have the ambition to shape a sustainable transition to a bio-based and circular economy. So our members really cover sector leaders from aviation, shipping, chemical, consumer goods, science, environmental and social NGOs. And this is really what makes the RSB unique. And this is really also what is needed for this discussion, because we all see the challenges that our societies and economies are now facing. And we need these platforms like the RSB, where the relevant voices can come together to one table to discuss solutions to overcome these challenges and create not only the zero carbon, but also the sustainable transition of the economy. And when we are discussing with our members, this discussion is cross-sectoral. It covers all the different parts of the supply chain, the science-backed, and includes also voices of the civil society. And this is also what makes the RSB standard so unique, because this is how we developed it, bringing all those different stakeholders together. And now the RSB is amongst the most credible standards already available, supported by many NGOs globally, because we have this best practice on how to produce sustainably feedstocks and also products, those that are needed for the transition, like also the sustainable marine fuels. And we do have already a certification system operational, and we cover also the sustainability holistically. So not only looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, but also looking into other dimensions of sustainability, covering water, soils, also looking at social consequences of agriculture-based fuels, which can be negative, but also positive, by the way. Just looking at the potential of creating additional income for a rural population, or on the environmental side, positive impacts of sequestering carbon. And I think a sustainability standard beyond risk mitigation can also work on showcasing more of those positive impacts on the economic, on the social and environmental dimension, because this can then create also the enabling environment for new fuel supply chains to develop in the different regions. And I also want to congratulate SSI for developing this robust framework with a strong set of sustainability criteria and looking into elements also like indirect land use changes, foregone sequestration and displacement effects. And with that, I think SSI really showed also that you're really ambitious in your sustainability goals. So the standard that we already operate is looked at by policymakers to guide also their decisions that shape the transition, recognized by the EU RED for road transport. And by the way, when looking at aviation, it was a key resource to develop the sustainability framework of the ICAO, which is the UN body for civil aviation, CORSIA sustainability criteria. And I think, and here, what I really like to echo was what Catherine just said. I think the shipping sector should really build on what is already available, because there are many certification systems already available. with two systems already recognized under CORSIA for civil aviation. There's already a decade of experience to certify complete fuel supply chains. And I think shipping, the shipping sector shares the same fuel supply chains of those fuels that are currently available with aviation and road transport. And I think therefore it is really crucial to develop on the existing models of the certification schemes instead of reinventing the wheel, because I think there's really a lot of opportunity also to rapidly develop certified sustainable supply chains if you're really ready to harmonize between the standards and build upon what is already there.
Excellent. Thank you, Elena. It is very insightful. First of all, thank you for correcting me that you are the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. As you pointed out, the use of biomaterials has certainly expanded recently. And I know you had started as biofuels, but it's great to know that you're looking at all those different angles. And your 2 points on, first of all, having that holistic view, and also this idea of building on what is available, and especially from a certification side. And maybe I'll ask one question back to you specifically on that. And in terms of the role of standard setting and certification, what role do you see that playing in actually allowing shipping to get to zero emissions? Is that going to be a key piece? Presumably, that's going to be something that's important. But what does that pathway look like?
Sure, happy to answer that one, because I think it's also multifaceted. Because first we have the standard setting role, and I think this is here key to have this dialogue with the stakeholders who are active and important in the sector on the sustainability sectors that are key and relevant in the sector to implement, and also to agree on those practices. And I think this is a standard setting work. Because we need also a broad consensus. We also need that there is a strong push from the sector coming for a strong and holistic set of sustainability criteria. We need leaders like Maersk to take on those ambitious goals, to then also push the rest of the sector with them. And I think the standard setting piece is crucial to gain this momentum for a holistic set of sustainability criteria. And I think and therefore I always take this as example of aviation because it can also show how this momentum can be built. For example, in the RSB, we have SAFUG as a member. That's an association called Sustainable Aviation Fuel User Group, representing in volume 30% of the fuel needed for civil aviation. And they pledged for RSB certification. And this, I think, is really a very, very important and strong push for those ambitious goals. And then, of course, looking more on the implementation side, we also look into ensuring that the best practice standards also get implemented. And one element here, of course, is the certification system that we operate, that is available to all fuel producers. And beyond the certification, we also work with full supply chain to implement sustainability practices. And then the last element that I wanted to mention here is, or maybe reinforce here, that also standards that they are developed can also guide policymakers, because we need this enabling environment with mandates that include strong sustainability criteria. So I think all these elements are needed, but we also see policymakers, how they look, for example, at the RSB to guide their decisions on how to include and incorporate sustainability criteria into their mandates and policies.
Thank you, Elena. And you mentioned Maersk, obviously taking a specific role there. Ingrid Maria, I'd like to ask you the question around kind of how does Maersk see this playing out? Because you have a role of exploring the fuels that you're buying, and obviously that's not limited to just one fuel. It's limited to a broad range of fuel. I mean, do you see the creation of a sustainable shipping fuel user group equivalent? So what are the lessons that that might be taken from aviation?
Well, I very much echo Elena's points of view on the sustainability and certification on future fuels. So I think we can, as an industry, certainly learn from other industries, from the work that has been done there. And aviation is a really good example of an industry where thorough work has been done in this space. Very much agree to not having to reinvent the wheel, but rather build on on existing good standards that are out there. And of course, as a ship owner, from our side, I very much see the need for this, because it's not an easy landscape to navigate, this landscape of future fuels, because of the lack of standards, sustainability standards for marine fuels. So I certainly agree to the industry having a big role to play when it comes to driving the creation of suitable sustainability standards for future fuels.
Thank you very much. Catherine, just to take that to you. I mean, so there's a lack of standards out there. What, from your perspective, might it look like for these standards to arise, and how would we deal with standards for different types of fuels on a kind of an already complicated landscape?
Yeah, interesting question, and like you said, very complicated landscape, particularly when we start to look at the potential fuels that could be used in the maritime sector. And then when you look at all the potential ways of producing those fuels, you end up with a very complex landscape of end fuel and production pathway to get to that end fuel. And I think some things, what we can learn from the experience that's happening at the moment, something like biofuels, they can be tested, so you can test them. But when you start to think, well, how do you start to test a hydrogen molecule to know that it is come from a renewable electricity source? It's been produced in that way. So I think it does get very complex. But without the standard and the setting that standard, setting that best practice and that expectation, both that can be set from a policy perspective, then that will really help to unlock investment flowing into the sector to be able to develop these fuels. But it also provides the end user with that kind of guidance again on decision making of when they're looking at business choices. And then ultimately the shipping customer, the shipping customer wants to know that their products are being shipped in a sustainable way, and all they need to specify is the fuel you're using to move my goods meets this standard. So I think when you look at the different stakeholders across the maritime value chain, they're all going to find use in having those standards, and having the standards early in the transition phases, starting with the standards now rather than in 10 years time, or it really helps unlock some of the barriers and provide the direction going forward. And I think that's what's really important at where we are at the moment in the transition, is to have something that really points and heads in the right direction, and having a sustainability standard now at this point can help unlock that and direct that investment and effort going forward.
Thank you, Catherine. And so two points that you just brought up. So one of those is traceability. So if you have that molecule that was generated from renewable energy or something like that, how is that traceable? And I think the other thing that you alluded to is kind of this accounting for that molecule as well. So one is where is the actual molecule? And the other is that molecule on board the vessel, or is it on another vessel, and does that matter? And maybe I'll just open that up to anybody who wants to kind of comment on that. I mean, that traceability, what does that look like? And maybe Elena, you can kind of start with that side of things, because that's something that you guys have experience with. And then on the accounting side, is this the fuel that's on a certain vessel, or is this a fuel that's in a fleet, or is it the fuel that's somewhere? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it's really an excellent question, a question that we definitely look into, because we also see for new fuel developments in shipping, but also in aviation, that what we really need now is a push to incentivize also the development of the new fuel production capacities. And at this point in time, it is key to get an innovative, really sustainable fuel to a customer that would be also willing to pay a price premium. And I think in such a situation, it can be a barrier insisting on a certain molecule to be on a certain ship or even in a certain fleet. And therefore, we are currently looking into book and claim solutions. So those are solutions where a physical, sustainably certified fuel is available, and then you would decouple the environmental benefits, all the sustainability characteristics from that fuel using a centralized database, which would enable you to bring the benefits of that fuel to a customer somewhere else. And this centralized database or registry allows the credibility and ensures robustness and ensures that there is no double counting happening. So we're currently looking into this. We just embarked on a pilot project together with RBP for aviation, because we think that this is really a key point. But I also wanted to refer to something else that Catherine just said when you talked about how important it is already now to have a sustainability standard, because it enables or it allows to guide also investments into the right direction. I think this is also key. And what we are, for example, doing is in a really early stage, when we're about to look into how can we in a certain region develop the bioeconomy or develop a market for new aviation fuel and develop a fuel potential. We are now really taking a landscape level approach, because it is so crucial to first understand where's the feedstock coming from. So what we are also doing based on our sustainability standard that we use as a framework to assess what is the sustainable available feedstock potential in a certain region, not only today, but also in 5, 10, 15 years, when maybe the impacts of climate change are kicking in. Maybe today it is completely reasonable to grow sugarcane somewhere, but maybe in 10 years, not anymore. So it would be very wise to maybe look into other feedstocks that can be better grown in water scarce areas. So we do these assessments, and then together with stakeholders in a region, assess what are the characteristics, also the economic characteristics of a region, to develop together with those stakeholders a roadmap looking into what practical steps need to be done to develop a alternative fuel production in that area. And for example, we recently completed our work for a sustainable aviation fuel roadmap in Ethiopia. And I think with this type of work, you can really early on guide the investments into a direction where they are sustainable, so that you're not coming into a situation where you first develop some alternative fuel supply chains and then later on try to somehow put on top the sustainability framework or certification. I think it is really key that it is already looked at the really early investment and project development level.
Thank you. So that final point, I think, is critical, that idea that the sustainability elements have to be built into the structure and the supply chains of these future fuels. They can't be something that's just laid over the top of it afterwards at great risk of having it be potentially unsustainable and unable to become sustainable. So thank you for that. Ingrid, one question for you. Now, of course, the role of kind of guiding investments was just mentioned, and Maersk has been in the news for making some tremendous investments on the vessel side. And obviously the next step is to figure out how to make the investments and where to make the investments on the fuel side. And so as you're looking at those investments, and you're looking at certainly e-methanol was the one fuel that you mentioned, is there a role for biomethanol and e-methanol, and how are you looking at this landscape without the criteria that are fully developed yet? What does that look like for you?
Well, it is a complex landscape to look at, and I like Elena pointing out the time aspect of these feedstocks, because there are feedstocks today that might be available and sustainable in today's criteria. But as the world develops and we get better at not producing so much waste and better at using waste for good uses, then there will be less of those feedstocks available to us to base our fuels on. So, and we don't want to base our fuels on first generation feedstocks that could have been used for food. So we need to also look at the timing at what becomes available in the future, or what may be there in 5-10 years from now. And that's I mean, that's more of an availability issue than it is a sustainability issue. But I think it's important to keep that timing aspect in mind as well. But I mean, of course, when we develop new fuel projects, we look to the existing standards, among others, the RSB standards, to help them guide us to develop supplies of fuels that are sustainable. But of course, it would be a great advantage for us just to have a standard in our hand that we can give to future suppliers and say, this is the one standard that works for marine fuels. And I very much agree to the availability aspect as well, because if you have a robust standard or certification system, then it's also easier for the makers of the fuels to produce the fuels meeting those standards. So it is a little bit a chicken and egg problem. If there's no certification schemes, then it's also a little bit of a barrier for the availability of sustainable marine fuels.
Thank you. You mentioned the chicken and egg. You also mentioned this idea of one standard, and Elena, you mentioned earlier that there were two standards in aviation. And Catherine, what's your thoughts on kind of overcoming this chicken and egg? And do you think that there's going to be, is there potential for a single standard, or is that wishful thinking? But even still, 2 or 3 could probably, make it work. And if there's competing standards, maybe that's not a bad thing either.
I think if there's multiple standards, then we might open up, credibility. I don't know. I guess it's a case of how consistent are they? So there may be multiple standards, but are they pretty much the same set of criteria, the same minimum requirements? Because I think when you start to look at the requirements within the standard, you wouldn't want one standard that had lower set of requirements to another one, because then that might shift and drive the market in a certain way that is not down a sustainable route. So but I think there are 2 main standards for biofuels that are used in the market today, and I think the question is, can we take these existing standards? How easily can they be applied to other potential types of fuels? So we talk a lot around some of the electro fuels that are being talked around for shipping's transition as well. Can we take do these existing standards apply to those? And also just start to make sure that they include all the criteria and the minimum requirements that stakeholders within the maritime value chain that would expect and need. So I think there are things already there that are being used, and I'd like to think that we can harmonize around that, because shipping's not going to have its own unique fuel. A product is going to be produced for multiple markets. So from a producer's perspective, they want to produce a product that meets a standard, they can put it on the market, and it meets all potential markets. It's not about, I think if shipping goes down the route of trying to create its own standard, it's probably reinventing the wheel and taking on too much work. And I think it's a case of looking at what there is, because it will make it easier from a producer's perspective. They produce a product, it meets a set of minimum sustainability requirements, it goes on the market, multiple sectors will then be able to use that product. And then the questions then just come around the point of, I guess the obligations across the supply chain and the point of certification, whether that happens when the product leaves its premises or whether that happens at the point of receipt with the purchaser of the product. And I guess we just need to think about where that point of certification happens in the value chain.
And I think you made an important point about kind of, first of all, not wanting to reinvent the wheel, but I think it goes beyond that, because there's actually a danger of, despite the effort that it would take to develop a separate standard, as from the supply point of view, then having different certifications is going to make everything much more complicated. But while you were talking about the value chains, Elena, that made me think of one other thing. I mean, looking at the value chain just on biomaterials, on the biofuel side of things, we saw a slide earlier that Andrea presented that showed a very, very long value chain. And then at the very end, there was a vessel. Are you able to certify all the way up to the vessel, or how much of that can you cover? And then what is the role of things after that?
Yeah, so the difficulty here is really that most of the sustainability risks are right at the beginning of the value chain, where you have, for example, a biomaterial, a crop grown, and this is where all the stakeholders want to make sure that it is really sustainable, that no forests were cut down for the crop, that human rights and labor rights are adhered to, that you're not destroying any ecosystems. So it is really, really important to start right at the beginning of the value chain, and then to track the sustainability information through the value chain to make sure that the end customer using the final fuel, or even then the let's say the client of a Maersk, really knows that the fuel that they purchased or used is really in line with the sustainability standards, so that their zero carbon commitments are underpinned by strong sustainability framework as well. And I wanted to say also two other things that were raised. Working for really the gold standard on sustainability. I mean, of course, I'd wish that the entire industry is applying such a gold standard. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that it is possible for the industry to improve and get better. And there are different levels of sustainability that are implemented. And I think it's really important to also provide for a pathway by which the different entities of the supply chain can improve. So, and therefore, I think it is also important to have different levels of sustainability that allows for such a journey. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention, because I think, Catherine, you mentioned also the power-to-X technologies using renewable electricity. So in the RSB, we already started to look at this. We are just about to launch a power-to-X working group within our stakeholders and membership with the goal to establish a best practice for sustainability for this new fuel type. And we hope that we can publish first results from this working group very soon.
Excellent, thank you, Elena. I think that point that you make on the pathway for improvement, that it's a journey, is also really important. It's not just black and white, something is certified as sustainable or it's not. What happens with everything else, or if something that's close? How do you create that the encouragement for those to kind of cross that gold standard threshold? You also spoke a bit about the value chain, and Ingrid Marie, if I can turn to you on that. I mean, the role of the end customer in creating the demand, the shippers, the lenders, the investors, the end users. How do you see this coming into play from Maersk's perspective? Is this something that you're seeing already? Are they asking for either the certification or just kind of to understand what that looks like, or is the demand not even there yet?
No, the demand is certainly there, and the interest is certainly there, and decarbonization is, as we see it, becoming a key priority for many of our customers. And the emissions we have in our scope 1, so our emissions from burning fuels, that's the scope 3 emissions of our customers. And many of our customers have set very ambitious targets for decarbonizing their entire supply chains, including their scope 3 emissions. So there's a very, very strong interest from our customers in the solutions we can offer them. And they are also interested in what kinds of fuels we burn and how much we reduce CO2 emissions from burning those fuels, and what kind of feedstocks we use, and what kinds of certification schemes we use. So we very much see this interest from the customers as something that's growing, and something that's already what we need to take into account for these projects. And as Elena says, ensuring this certification end to end. So it's a lot stronger for us to be able to tell the customers that this fuel is certified to this standard. It creates a lot more transparency and trust in the products that we offer to our customers.
Great, thank you for that. We've had a few questions in the chat, 2 questions in the chat that were related to ISO. One was kind of the potential role for ISO more broadly. And then a second question specifically asking about how RSB standard would work with an ISO standard. So maybe Elena, you could start with that, and then I'm sure that Catherine, you and Ingrid Marie would be able to comment on that as well.
Sure, happy to do that. So I think we said already that there somehow needs to be also different levels in the sustainability standards, because there are different ambitions of sustainability, different stages where somebody's in. And I think while there are different ambitions on sustainability, I think it is key that we have one central metric on how we measure sustainability. And I think here ISO can be a very, very important international norm that can be this basic on how to measure sustainability, and based on that I think the different standards can then describe their ambitions on sustainability. And this is also how we refer to ISO standards. So whenever there is a standard already available, we are very happy to take this on board to references and base our standards on that. So for example, I just mentioned book and claim. I know that there is currently the ISO work on a chain of custody, and we included what is already available in their terms and definitions and descriptions as a basis for our standard that we can then base our work on.
Great, thank you. And Catherine, from your perspective, from a class society perspective, do you see a role for ISO standards?
Yes, and I like how Alina has said that sustainability standard, ISO can set that, here's how you measure sustainability, and then standards can fall out underneath that. But I wonder if the question was also related to the fact that the marine industry currently has a fuel quality standard, which is an ISO standard. And so I think there's this piece around fuel quality and the sustainability of the fuel. And because I think we're still going to need to have that quality piece that, particularly when we start looking at some of these fuels, methanol, ammonia, hydrogen derived fuels, when we start to say, well, the physical properties and the technical specification of those fuels is still going to be needed. And so is that how the ISO 8217 marine fuel standard evolves to include these fuels from a technical and physical property? But then how do we marry the sustainability of those fuels into that? Do we keep the two separate? Do they come together? And I think, I don't know the answer, but I see that question coming up a little bit more, and something that needs to be thought through, I think.
Thanks, Catherine. So Ingrid Marie, maybe just to you very quickly on the ISO, is this something that you're looking for at Maersk?
Yeah, of course we look at the ISO standard for marine fuels, but as we also discussed earlier, I think the way things are developing is that marine fuels will not be unique in the future from fuels used in the land space. So we will be pretty much using the same fuels as everybody else. So I see more a need for the sustainability side than in the future to have specific marine fuel standards.
Excellent, thank you for that. So maybe just as we wrap up this conversation, I could turn to each of you and just, sustainability criteria for marine fuels, obviously this is something that's very important. We're hearing clearly that this is something that's needed. What is next to advance this topic? What are the next steps in this space to take things to the next level? I'll go Catherine, Elena, Ingrid.
So I'm going to say, kind of wrap up on 3 things that we sort of thought about in the past, is getting a clear definition around the principles and the requirements for those principles. So there's no ambiguity, I think, in that. Looking at those existing schemes and seeing how we can harmonize across sectors and with the existing schemes. And then I think the conversation then needs to turn to practical application. Where in the supply chain, how you avoid fraud, those kind of practical application perspectives.
Thank you, Catherine. That was principles requirement, building on existing schemes and harmonization, and then that practical application of making sure it can work actually on a vessel. Elena.
And I completely agree with all of that, and would like to add that I think that now it would be needed for the industry leaders with a strong sustainability ambition to come together to really create momentum for an ambitious sustainability framework for shipping being adopted by the shipping industry. And then I think it is also needed to work with IMO to ensure IMO targets are really ambitious and also include sustainability considerations, also learning from what has been developed in international aviation through CORSIA.
Great, thank you, Elena. So that was certainly industry leaders to kind of come together to create that framework, and then working with IMO to make sure that the broader sustainable criteria are included and building on the airline model from CORSIA. Ingrid Marie, to you.
Yeah, it's nice to be last, so then I can just agree with the Catherine and Elena and what they just said, and echo that we need to look at existing standards and build on those. And from our perspective as a user of the fuel, of course, we have the privilege to work with current and future suppliers of these fuels. So we also have, as I see it, a big role to play there in working with the suppliers to actually have their fuels certified to the standards that we see fit for that, and also to work with the suppliers, because there are new fuels developing, as Elena said, the electro fuels, so to work with the certification bodies on developing standards for the fuels that are not existing yet, but will be existing in the future. So we very much see ourselves having a role to play in that space as well.
Excellent, thank you, Maria. So an offer there from at least one industry player, and I'm sure there's others that would echo that as well, an offer to work together with the standard makers to make sure that those can be made and can be applicable. These comments build on the comments that we heard earlier around that we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel, that the fuels used in shipping are multi-sectoral and will be used in other industries such as aviation, and that we need to build on all of the knowledge that we can. And finally, that sustainability really needs to be built into the foundation of any criteria, and that it can't be something that can be just added on later. So that's something that that we need to make sure is integrated. So with that, I want to thank our panelists, Catherine Palmer, Global Sustainability Manager of Marine and Offshore at Lloyd's Register, Ingrid Marie Anderson, Head of Decarbonization, Target and Lifecycle Analysis at AP Moller Maersk, and Elena Schmidt, Executive Director at the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. So thank you all very much. And with that, back to you at SSI and Andrea to close the session. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. The discussion was brilliant. Thank you, Randall, for wonderful moderating. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Ingrid Marie and Elena, for a really great discussion. We're going to take the reflections from the sessions and consider them very thoroughly in our endeavor to bring to the forefront the sustainability assurance of zero and low carbon marine fuels. Do watch this space. We are not done now that we've created the sustainability criteria. I'm just gonna put again the slide up for you, for those of you that weren't there at the beginning. If you scan the QR code, you can download our report. And then do engage with us. If you're interested in this topic, there's our contact details there. You can also find us on our website. Thank you again, everyone. It was a really great discussion. Have a great rest of the day or morning, evening, wherever you are based. Thank you and goodbye.